When my grandfather died on July 2, 2014, we had a simple question to answer. What do you do when a life resists a monument? Between sentiment and spectacle, between marble and ritual, we chose tending over triumph. In the week after his funeral, between July 7 and July 14, 2014, whenever weather and bodies allowed, a handful of neighbors and relatives came by to dig and plant. Lavender went beside the shed where he kept twine and an old pair of gloves. Daffodils were set in a neat row along the south side under the pear tree. An heirloom iris was tucked into the exact patch where his boots used to rest while he read the town paper in the evenings. We chose plants that required work. Lavender that needed pruning, daffodils that demanded division, an iris that would have to be tended through frost and mud. The choice was deliberate, not a refusal of memorial but a refusal of a single, static gesture. We wanted returns that were patient, recurrent, and unassuming. Those first gatherings felt domestic and improvised. People arrived with a pot of soup, a thermos of coffee, loaves, and a jar of pickled plums. We sat on blankets or the low, crumbling stone wall, past platters and mugs, and past stories. Sometimes we put on his tapes, old cassettes he had recorded in fits of thrift and stubbornness, and let them play on a battered machine. For some, the cassettes supplied the exact shape of memory, how he elongated the name of a neighboring town, the cadence he used to land a joke. For others, recordings only underscored that no playback replaces the ordinary labor of living beside someone. Technology arrived as temptation and possibility. On October 18, 2014, a neighbor who worked at a small software startup brought an old Technics cassette deck he had rigged with a USB out and a laptop. He spoke in confident future-forward terms that grief makes persuasive, magnetic tape deteriorates, digital copies can be backed up in the cloud and might, if managed properly, survive forever. He used words like preservation and immortality with the comfort of someone promising permanence. I agreed to digitize the tapes but insisted on limits. Over several afternoons in late October and early November 2014 we played the cassettes on a calibrated playback deck, captured files at high bitrate, and saved each segment with a metadata sheet noting the date of the original recording, who was present, the context, and a brief description of the contents. The files were placed in a controlled cloud folder with restricted access and a written agreement. What I thought of then as a compact against misuse. That compact hardened into law on December 15, 2014. On that date we formalized a small trust to oversee the archive and drafted bylaws that read like legalese folded into a prayer: protect, preserve, prevent harm. The trust's founding document allowed educational uses, community workshops on eldercare, oral history classes, listening sessions, while forbidding uses that would sensationalize, monetize, or exploit. From the start, the project was an experiment in making moral choices enforceable by paper and practice. We wanted the tapes to be instruments of repair, not spectacle. If the trust gave the archive its legal frame, a retired nurse, whose name I rarely used in public though she remained never far from my thought, became its moral anchor. Our neighbor and occasional carer for years, she had retired in 2010 but never abandoned the garden's life. Saturday mornings in 2015 and 2016 she came by to keep the beds company, sit with tea that always needed reheating, and stitch an absent order back into the place. One January morning in 2015, when frost rimed the shed roof and the pear tree stood stark against an east light that had not yet warmed the air, I sat on the porch with the tape player and a seaside postcard folded in my hand. She sat down without asking, put her palm over mine, and said plainly, "You did good." Nurses are not lavish with praise, they know bodies and their limits. Her sentence felt like a report card I had not earned and a bench someone had set out in front of me. The months became calendars of small duties and occasional surprises. Beginning in September 2015, I taught a small course at the community college, listening as a civic act, once each semester, limited to 15 students. The course was practical: how to cradle a cassette, shield a photograph from breath, place a legible label for 50 years, and technical: how to digitize tapes without adding hiss, choose sampling rates, and capture metadata consistently. But its harder lessons were ethical: where curiosity ends and intrusion begins, how to phrase questions that invite rather than pry, and how power dynamics shape which voices are recorded and which people are left vulnerable. Each class began, deliberately, with 5 minutes of silence to teach attention to sound's edges. Students introduced themselves with a single sentence about their relation to a device: child, sibling, neighbor, professional, so they knew how identity shapes listening. Projects that emerged were modest: transcriptions for the town library, listening sessions at a hospice, guides for senior centers. But the course changed practices. Students phoned aging relatives more often and learned to be quiet and let stories come. Not all encounters were gentle. On August 24, 2015, my parents asked for a family-only tea on my grandfather's birthday. I considered refusing. An intimate gathering could have rehearsed old power dynamics I did not want, but in the end I consented. They set a tray of tea, scones, and postcards on the table. At my request, we played a single minute of tape in which he explained how to prune a rosebush in late winter. After the recording, my mother said plainly she had been wrong about how she had spoken to him in his last months. There was no cinematic collapse, only out-loudness and a short exchange that could be accepted and answered with apology. These rituals were not cures, they were acts of tending, precisely the thing my grandfather preferred. On November 11, 2015, a cousin I had last seen arguing in a lawyer's office over an estate slice sent a letter. He had remarried and moved 3 hours away to a town with outreach programs for elderly veterans. Restless after the lawyer's visit, he had read my grandfather's notebooks and compiled a list of small domestic things he missed: the glass used at breakfast, the way the fence gate creaked at 4 in the afternoon, the shape of his cough. We exchanged letters and then, in January 2016, a phone call, awkward at first, then softer than I had dared imagine. There was no cinematic forgiveness, only slow, awkward knitting. 2 frayed strands returned to a usable weave. My grandfather insisted people practice good habits: return, tend, try. The cousin's outreach was less about absolution than deciding to keep trying. The archive matured into a modest civic institution with rhythms of its own. It was never a reliquary, but people treated it that way. On a bright afternoon in March 2016, an elderly man came to the community center asking to hear his wife's voice from a cassette she had tucked away before she died. In June 2016, a member of the genealogy club asked whether any tape might hold evidence of an old family recipe. I sat with listeners in small rooms, low light, a kettle on the stove, cued old files, and watched as a recorder's hiss unfurled like breath. When the tape began, speech and ambient sounds, chairs scraping, the rumble of a kettle, unlocked memory. People cried and laughed. They found in a vowel or a hum what confirmed a life's particularity. These were not revelatory scandals but constellations, small points of light that altered how people oriented toward the past. Mistakes taught humility. In March 2016, a transcription mistakenly attributed a remark to the wrong speaker. We corrected it, apologized, and updated the metadata. In late 2017, we inadvertently liberalized permissions for a short period and had to tighten them. Each misstep instructed us to be clearer, more patient, and to make policy practical. The discipline was not moral purity but returning to work and repairing what had been broken. The surrounding town did not stand still. In March 2017, glossy brochures arrived in mailboxes showing renderings of a condominium complex with a rooftop garden and simplified figures beneath a stylized skyline. It felt like a particular erasure, a proposal to replace soil with a sanitized roofscape where plants would be decorative rather than rooted. We organized petitions, gathered letters from longtime residents, and held an open house at the community center on June 12, 2017. Neighbors testified to the garden as a memory repository and breathing place. The developers had lawyers and slick presentations. We had persistence and patchwork authenticity. A small nonprofit that had emerged from our community group lent legal muscle. The victory was pedestrian, mundane in the best way. It preserved the everyday work of a place rather than turning it into a performative tableau. Not every incident was dignified. In October 2016, a distant cousin inherited a box of postcards and misread their worth, putting a handful, including the seaside postcard I had kept folded in my wallet for years, on an online auction site. A friend tipped me off. At a cafe, I met the cousin who looked like someone accustomed to calculating margins. He was thinly apologetic. I bought back the postcards for an amount routine at an auction, but real relief to him. He admitted to being short on rent and afraid to ask for help. We handled the moment as my grandfather would have preferred, An ordinary transaction addressing an ordinary need rather than a public morality play. There were comic nights that kept the work human. In July 2016, raccoons discovered our compost heap and treated it like an all-you-can-eat buffet. We improvised a night watch, neighbors took shifts, teenagers were delighted at being deputized, and someone brought a lantern that threw long, theatrical shadows across the beds. One young volunteer, microphone slung as if for a documentary, asked the nurse if she had ever been afraid of animals on the job. She told a story about a feral cat that had sat on a patient's chest and refused to budge for hours, purring like a small engine. We laughed until our throats were hoarse. Laughter acted like mulch, keeping the soil of collective stewardship warm. Practical and ethical questions required steady attention. How long keep original tapes? Dispose once digitized or preserve as artifacts? How handle journalists seeking human interest soundbites? We wrote policies that were both moral and legal. Original cassettes went into a climate-controlled box in the community center archive. Access was restricted and required an application with a statement of purpose. Journalists could be granted access only with prior family consent and a provision against sensationalism. This was slow lawyering, the patient construction of boundaries people would respect. Requests arrived constantly and often tenderly small. A woman wanted to reproduce an old family soup recipe, hoping a tape might mention a pinch of something. A man hoped to hear his wife's voice ordering the children to tuck in their shirts. A teacher requested a small clip for a dialect lesson. I invited listeners into the small room with the kettle and the dog-eared manual on obsolete equipment. We queued files and worked on transcription. Sometimes tears followed, sometimes laughter. Sometimes the result was quiet validation. A voice confirming the cadence of a kitchen morning or the pitch of a joke. Those confirmations stitch a life back into the present in a necessary, non-theatrical way. The archive's reach grew unevenly outward. A grad student in sociology cited a clip in a 2019 paper about family negotiations in grief. The community college's nursing program adopted a listening lab into its practicum in 2020. The Genealogy Club volunteered to index names in our metadata schema in exchange for permission to play clips at meetings. Access formalized into 3 categories: family, educational, and research. Full archival access required a written application evaluated by the trust. Journalistic requests followed a stricter path: family consent plus contextual use. In summer 2018, a filmmaker approached us seeking clips for a short documentary. The trust approved limited use contingent on editorial review and contextual framing. The film screened at the community center on May 16, 2019. Reactions were mixed. Some applauded, others felt uncomfortable, and we took that as a complicated success. Not all compromises felt like victory. In spring 2017, the rose bush planted for my grandfather's 93rd birthday was stolen. We could have escalated into a legal case. Instead, we replaced the bush and added a small plaque that read only his birth and death years. The gardener who helped said bluntly, "Gardens are made of loss and replacement," and the sentence felt like practical truth. The archive could not adjudicate every moral failure. Several times a neighbor's failure of care unfolded and there was no lever to pull. Stewardship, I learned, is not a promise to fix every wrong. It is a commitment to show up in ways that make goodness likelier, not certain. The nurse's practical wisdom became an informal curriculum. She taught cushions to ease a patient's knees, how to quiet a cough without a flurry, and how to coax a waning appetite. She spoke of music's power, how a song could change a room, and of the small economies of care. The costliest items are seldom monetary but time and attention. When she laughed, it was a sound you trusted. When she scolded a teenager who left a shovel in the path, she did so because she wanted the place to function for those who would come after. Sometimes the archive's moral imagination extended beyond the garden. When a neighbor with a failing hip could no longer tend his beds, committee members visited and weeded. When a widow struggled to change a porch bulb, someone replaced it and left a pie on the step. The archive did not create neighborliness ex nihilo, but it provided a code: small attentions matter. The exchange of care became contagious in human-scale ways. Correspondence kept widening the conversation. On January 22, 2018, a woman wrote from a city of glass towers after she read an essay about our garden. She recognized its echo in the tiny patch her grandfather had tended. Late April 2018, when the first green pushed through the soil, she arrived and stayed 3 days. She sat with the nurse, a few regulars and me, and sometimes broke into tears when a cadence in my grandfather's speech matched the way her grandfather rounded vowels to praise a stew or scold a cat. She had come not for facts but for permission to remember someone whole, flaws included. She left a painted jar that now perches on the shed windowsill to catch the light. Exchanges like hers felt like gifts passing through rather than being hoarded. Anger has its uses. It clarifies and forces decisions. I missed that speed sometimes. But anger also consumes tender shoots you might otherwise protect. The archive encouraged a different rhythm, slow, cumulative, maddeningly ordinary. It demanded routine. Call the nurse, pay the bill, prune the rose, answer a neighbor's question, refill the bird feeder. These small, repeated practices softened the town incrementally. People returned phone calls, passed casseroles, and listened before speaking. A recorded voice often imposed a certain decency. It asks for a breath, a pause, and a kinder response. I think my grandfather would have liked that. Not an archive as monument but an archive as civic practice. We had to guard the project's integrity. In December 2018 the Trust refused a request we judged exploitative. In 2020 we approved a project that initially made me skeptical but proved thoughtful. We convened on the first Tuesday of every month to deliberate appeals and rare public uses. The boundaries were negotiated, revised, and sometimes painfully reconsidered. The work often felt like an obligation I had volunteered for. Sometimes the flood of requests made me long for a full-time archivist, a secure budget, or a better digital platform. I dreamed of grants and a dedicated server, and then returned to the bench and the tape player and remembered the project's base was elbow grease. Volunteers who showed up with gloves, sandwiches, and stubbornness. The archive survived less because of institutional heft and more because of people who cared for small things. There were administrative failures and small reforms. We tightened metadata practices, required clearer statements of purpose, and formalized access into 3 categories: family, educational, research. We learned to make permissions practical. The discipline was not pretending to perfect moral clarity but returning to the mundane work of keeping things honest. Correct a transcription, restore a mislabeled file, close a loophole in permissions. The archive's task was less to solve grief than to set a climate in which attention and responsibility were habitual. The nurse grew older, and with age came ordinary wishes. One October afternoon in 2019 she knelt by the perennial bed with a trowel and said quietly that if anything happened to her she wanted to be buried under the magnolia. We laughed and later pressed play on a tape she had made years earlier, an old-fashioned recording of a woman telling a story about a childhood cat. She cried a little and we felt, for a moment, a loop close in a small but meaningful way. These were ordinary human things: vows, jokes, grief, and small practicalities. Hard to arrange and harder still to keep. Occasionally the archive's tracks reached institutions. A sociology graduate student cited a clip in a 2019 paper about family negotiations in grief. In 2020 the community college's nursing program adopted our listening lab into its practicum. The genealogy club helped index names in exchange for permission to play clips. Small exchanges that broadened the archive's modest public life. If you ever find yourself stewarding another person's final voice, remember you hold both power and a fragile trust. Use it to teach listening. Use it to make room for small, ordinary gestures of care. Keep legal bounds where necessary, but cultivate a moral imagination that prizes daily acts over public declarations. The nurse taught me that persistence, the quiet, often invisible return to the work, was frequently the most radical thing you could do. It costs mostly time, not righteousness. It asks you to be present, again and again, for small tasks and small satisfactions. Sometimes, on clear late summer evenings when basil scent rises and light softens over the beds, I sit on the bench and play a short clip. I do not do it to make anyone form an opinion or to stage a memorial. I do it because a voice, in the right intonation, can be a companion. I listen to his laugh, the way he says a neighborhood name, the slant of his voice when he praises a job well done, and then I go inside to prepare a meal for someone who needs it. The recordings have arranged signposts. They have not walked the path for me. The walking, messy, necessary, continuing, is my part, and I am grateful. Keep returning. Keep Keep showing up. The first time the nurse handed me one of his tapes was a late afternoon in a year, when I was still learning how to hold other people's lives without crushing them. It was November 2016. The leaves had slipped from the maples and the garden's late asters were gone to seed. We had been carting boxes out of his house for weeks, sorting the practical from the sentimental. An army of coffee cups in the sink, a scattering of books with marginalia in his strong hand, a cardigan with a seam split at the elbow. In the middle of a stack of VHS cases and a photo album, she put a cassette down on the battered kitchen table and tapped the label with a finger. His handwriting was there, small and deliberate. "Listen to this," she said. Her voice was the same steady instrument she'd used to cleanse a fevered brow or to suggest a softer pillow. There was, now and then, something threaded through it like an undertow. "He wanted you to have it. He asked me to give it to you if I thought you'd be able to listen." I remember thinking then that this was another form of stewardship, a small transfer of responsibility like handing a key. We had already archived other cassettes, digitized them and sealed the originals in a climate-controlled box at the community center. We'd written the legal forms, argued the precise language for consent, and then had to live with those forms, their leaves of paper, their compromises. But the cassette she placed in my hand was not yet submitted to policy, not yet catalogued. It felt to me like a private deposit, a slip of intimacy left in trust with a woman who had sat up nights at his bedside, who knew how he breathed when he was trying to keep a joke going. I took it home that evening because in those early months the archive's work bled into everything else. My grocery lists had metadata tags, my phone alarm reminded me of transfer schedules. I put the cassette into an ancient Walkman that bumped and hummed like a sleeping thing and sat at the kitchen table with the window dark beyond the sink. I found a quiet place in his voice at the beginning, the sound of tape engaging, the little mechanical thrum, and then him, speaking slowly as if forming each word mattered more than whatever else the day contained. What he said named the wound we all had been skirting. He said my name. He said that my parents had told him something I did not know and that it had hurt him. He said, in a voice that could be tender and rough by turns, that those words, someone telling him that I did not want him, had landed in a place where he could either harden or forgive. He chose forgiveness. He chose, aloud into the machine, to offer me a different story, that he had loved me, that he had understood more than I had thought, and that he hoped I would not carry anger where there might be better uses for my heart. I listened until the kitchen clock clicked past midnight. The tape was not theatrical in its revelation. He did not denounce or claim sainthood. Instead he told small things, a breakfast I had made him as a boy, the way I once sat on his lap to watch a thunderstorm, the precise way the light in the kitchen looked when he smiled. He mentioned a quarrel, brief, impossible to locate in its temporal coordinates, and then he told a nurse to show the tape to me. There was a moment when I realized he had recorded it deliberately for me, and that knowledge rearranged the room. The cassette, for all its analog modesty, was a sealed letter. He had spoken when the discipline of speaking into a machine made confession and care possible in a way face-to-face might not. When I returned the tape to the nurse the next day, I carried with me a weight I did not yet have language to name. She had expected the reaction that fell across my face, a complex mix of relief, grief, and peculiar trepidation. He didn't want me to make it public, she said, which was a way of reminding me the tape was an object with rules and consequences. But he wanted you to hear it. He told me not to let anyone else listen without his or your permission. That exchange, private, edged with a practical ethics, became a hinge in the archive's life. It forced us to ask sharper questions about consent and about what counts as the dying person's intention. We had been careful about written permissions, about legal guardians and next of kin, but the cassette revealed a middle ground, a spoken instruction, recorded and then left to the discretion of a nurse. The trust convened in January 2017 to consider whether dictated directives carried the same force as signed forms. The minutes of that meeting, filed in the archive and stamped with a committee's hesitancy, show how we parsed intention. We decided the practical thing. A recording marked by date and a clear instruction to a named person would be treated as a personal trust, its terms honored by the keeper, often a nurse, and by the individual archive steward. We also added a requirement, clear in language, but necessarily fragile, that if a tape's intent was to remain private it would be sealed in the climate-controlled box with the label sealed by patient. Access requires direct family consent or the patient's named designee. Those were bureaucratic words for a very human problem. The cassette had already done what legal forms sometimes cannot. It had softened a hard line between estrangement and reconciliation. I called my parents in early February 2017. We spoke carefully, and they did not deny the words they had given my grandfather when he lay dying. They defended it as a cruel mercy, an attempt to spare me a confrontation they assumed I couldn't bear. Their defense felt thin, but their shame was not performative. It settled into the lines of their faces. We did what families do. We argued, we apologized, we paused, and then we tried again. The tape became, for a while, an axis of our domestic conversation. I played it on nights when silence pressed too close. I played it aloud in the presence of my mother once, and she cried in a way that washed the words into new shapes. It did not undo months of neglect or years of misattunement. What it did was supply evidence that a life was more complicated than a sentence uttered out of fear. It provided a voice to a man who had loved me despite, perhaps, being spoken of in ways that reduced him. It offered a template for how we might live with the fact of each other's failures without allowing those failures to ossify into a myth. We registered the episode in the Trust Minutes as a case study. In December 2018, when the Trust refused an outside request we judged exploitative, the conversation about that cassette resurfaced. The refusal, in part, was shaped by an emerging sensitivity to the power that intimate recordings held and by a commitment to avoid turning last words into commodities. In 2019, when the filmmaker asked to include a clip in the short documentary screened on May 16, one of the conditions we insisted upon was proof of family consent where the material touched on living relatives. The filmmaker's work was thoughtful, and the screening at the community center provoked arguments about public memory and private sorrow. Some applauded the film's tenderness, others felt the camera had trespassed. For me, the cassette had practical, ongoing consequences. It altered my approach to stewardship. I stopped assuming that written releases captured all necessary consent. I began to treat spoken directives, particularly those mediated through a caregiver, as ethically salient. That required administrative change. We amended forms to include a line for spoken directives noted by caregiver, and asked that an accompanying statement be added when such a directive existed. This is the sort of bureaucratized tenderness the archive lives by. Enough formalism to protect, enough flexibility to honor the peculiar ways humans choose to communicate at life's end. The nurse's role in this was not only procedural, it was pedagogical. She used the moment to teach volunteers how to receive an object charged with intention. She taught us to ask, patiently and without accusation, what the donor wanted done with a recording. She told the story of a patient who had asked her, breathless with oxygen tubing and time, to be sure their daughter heard a laugh they feared might die with them. She trained us to translate those dying improvisations into something the archive could steward, a labeled cassette, a dated note, a sealed envelope. In late October 2019, sitting on a trowel-worn bench beneath the magnolia she loved, she told me she had kept a small stack of tapes like the one he'd given me for years, intending to pass them on as love notes rather than evidence. People change when they can hear themselves, she said, and we laughed in a way that acknowledged both her bluntness and a truth I had been learning. The tape's existence also intersected with the archive's public work. When the community college's nursing program adopted the listening lab into its practicum in 2020, we used anonymized clips to teach students about end-of-life communication and the ethics of recorded intent. We never played the tape himself in class. That remained private between me, the nurse, and a family navigating repair. But the tape inspired curricular materials, modules on consent, transcripts redacted to preserve identifying details, and discussions about the complexities of forgiving on behalf of someone who has been told he is not wanted. Students learned to listen for inflection as much as content. A grad student later cited a redacted clip in a 2019 paper on grief negotiations. The paper used such examples to argue for practices that honor both patient autonomy and family agency. The personal and the public braided together in ways that sometimes felt awkward. I wanted to keep the cassette as a private talisman. The nurse wanted me to share its lessons. We compromised by letting the cassette teach without letting the voice be displayed. I wrote a short piece about what it taught me, about forgiveness as practice rather than cure, and it was published in a local journal in March 2018. People wrote back. The woman in the glass tower wrote on January 22, 2018. Another neighbor sent recipes. Some letters thanked me for preserving the small humanness of it, others interrogated the ethics of publishing anything discovered under such fragile circumstances. We revised our policies in response, tightened our metadata, and required a clearer statement of purpose for access. Family dynamics shifted slowly. The roster of reparations was small and ordinary. My parents, who had once thought to shelter me by brokering an untruth, began to attend the archive meetings with a kind of humility I had not seen before. They helped plant a new rosebush in 2018 and, at my insistence, read the plaque aloud in public once. His birth and death years engraved simply, nothing else. There were no grand acts of contrition, no cinematic reunions. There were small changes. A casserole delivered without an addendum, an invitation to a garden day without an agenda, a phone call returned. Those are the real shape of mending, not dramatic gestures but incremental habits. The nurse's tapes multiplied. Over the following years she brought us other recordings, a man singing the first verse of a lullaby and then telling his grandson to live kindly, a woman dictating a list of practicalities for her sister in the precise cadence of someone who wanted to avoid vagueness, a soldier describing a garden he'd seen overseas and asking that someone remember the plant names. We treated each with careful questions about intent. Some were consigned to the sealed box, others were digitized and made available for family access under the Trust's three-tiered system. The archive grew not because it hoarded content but because it learned to shape a slow, ethical economy around those scraps of voice. Sometimes the tapes did things no one had anticipated. A clip from 1979 of my grandfather telling a story about a neighbor's stubborn goat was used in a dialect lesson at the community college in 2020. Students transcribed and then argued about regional pronunciations, and in the process discovered cultural histories none of them had known. A man came in to listen to his wife's recorded directions for making a chicken soup and discovered a seasoning ratio that changed how his family ate for a decade. The practical outcomes, laughter, recovery of culinary craft, an identity affirmed, stacked up beside the more delicate outcomes of forgiveness. The archive's mission refined itself to hold both. There were still things we could not fix. The stolen rosebush in spring 2017 remained a bruise that did not fully heal. We replaced it and planted a plaque, and the gardener's aphorism, "Gardens are made of loss and replacement," stuck in our conversations like a useful proverb. The nurse herself grew older and in autumn 2019, we joked about the idea of burying her under the magnolia as she had once requested. She laughed and, a little later, she wept into a tape she had recorded years before, a recollection of a cat and a kitchen that made sense in the way only memory can. We kept that tape sealed. Its purpose was not publicity but presence. If the archive taught me anything over these years, it was the simple radicalism of small acts repeated. Laws, minutes, and policies matter. So does the patient practice of returning a phone call, bringing supper, tending a rose. The cassette my grandfather recorded did not repair everything. It did offer a model. Humans can say cruel things in the moment of fear. They can also choose, before or after, to contain remorse and to speak into machines that keep those desires safe for someone else. The nurse's showing of the tape taught me that stewardship is an ethical art, a blend of careful record-keeping, reverent attention, and the willingness to take responsibility for being the keeper of a fragile thing. It taught me to listen not for drama but for instruction, and to honor a dying person's voice by obeying its expressed wishes whenever reasonably possible. The work continues. We meet on the first Tuesday of every month. We sift appeals in a room warmed by a kettle and the sound of someone turning pages. We judge requests with a mixture of lawyering and tenderness. We decline the exploitative. We approve the thoughtful. We keep the cassette he gave me in a secure box on the site and a digitized file accessible to me and the nurse and, with family consent, to others. I go out to the garden some evenings and press play on a clip that is not meant as evidence but as company. His laugh, the way he said a neighborhood name, the slant of his voice when he praised a job well done. These are the small articulations that live there, and they continue to shape the way I choose to walk through the neighborhood, to answer a phone, to tend a bed, and to show up when someone needs someone else. The tapes keep teaching and the archive keeps learning, and both of us, in our modest patience, keep moving toward whatever comes next. In the spring of 2020, the archives learned to listen without being in the same room. When the country closed its doors in March, our first Tuesday meetings did not stop. They migrated to a small rectangle on a laptop screen, a kettle in the background now reduced to a memory. From March through May, and then in intermittent waves for the next year, we convened by video, still bound to the ritual of turning pages and arguing over phrasing, but also forced to reckon with new questions the pandemic had thrown at us. People with time on their hands suddenly reached for devices and microphones. They sent us recordings of the kinds of errands and entreaties that had always existed at bedsides but had rarely been made technically durable: a son reading a grocery list into his phone for a mother who could no longer recall brand names, a woman telling her sister where she had hidden a box of letters, a man explaining to his daughters, in a voice so steady and businesslike that it made the listener flinch, precisely how to access his online passwords. The tape my grandfather had given me, the nurse had shown me that afternoon under the magnolia, acquired new relatives in a conceptual sense. It became part of an emergent conversation about what it means to make final words portable across distance and time, and what responsibilities fall to institutions that steward those words. In June 2020, the Trust convened an ad hoc working group to review our practices in light of remote donations and digital distribution. We had already amended the paper intake forms to include a line 4 spoken directives noted by caregiver. Now we had to draft a parallel for digital gifts, a consent flow that could be verified by video, a time-stamped attestation that a caregiver had been present, an option for multi-party authentication when family members were scattered across regions. We hammered out language by committee and, in August 2020, adopted a protocol we described, somewhat dully, as the Remote Consent Annex. It was meant to do three things: to protect donors, to protect recipients, and to formalize the intuition the nurse had taught us, that the voice of someone at the edge of things carries a kind of authority that must be honored, but never exploited. The pandemic also accelerated grant-making in areas we had once found peripheral. In March 2021, the Regional Heritage Fund awarded the Trust a modest grant, enough to purchase one professional-grade cassette digitizer, a climate-sealed cabinet for our analog holdings, and the services of a part-time technician. By June 2021, the cabinet sat in a corner of the listening room, the digitizer humming as it slowly translated fragile, hissy reels into files with precise bit depths and timecodes. It was tedious work, the slow conversion of analog into durable data, but it allowed us to meet new kinds of requests. Families who were barred from travel by lockdowns could now ask to hear a relative's last instructions without crossing the country. We created a 3-step access path that combined redaction options, viewing restrictions, and an appeal process that had to be used sparingly. The nurse's cassette remained in the Trust's secured drive, accessible to me, to the nurse herself when she asked, and, if family consent was provided, to others in their designated tier. There were legal anxieties too. New data protection guidance published in late 2020 urged institutions to consider not only consent but also the potential for harm if intimate recordings were disseminated in ways that could re-traumatize living relatives. We adjusted. In February 2021, we added a clause to the Trust's bylaws requiring an ethics review for any request that proposed public display and for any request that originated from a commercial producer. That amendment was tested sooner than we anticipated. In October 2021, a podcasting company with a large audience petitioned for access to a clip we had previously denied for reasons of privacy. The request concerned a woman's voice recorded in 2017 instructing how to manage a secretive family parcel. The estate's executor, living abroad, was ambivalent. The nurse and I remembered the woman's whispered laughter as she folded a towel. The company's attorney argued that the clip had cultural value. Our review panel, 3 Trust members, a legal advisor, and 2 community representatives, met on a rainy Thursday and, after several hours of testimony, denied the request. This decision became a point of public conversation when the company published a blog post critiquing our conservatism. Some in the wider community accused us of gatekeeping. Others wrote to thank us for holding a boundary that protected grief from becoming a content stream. The echo of that dispute lingered into 2022, informing subsequent appeals and compelling us to provide clearer reasons when we declined access. Not everything, however, was entangled in contention. Small, private reconciliations continued to be the slow work of repair. In late 2020, my parents and I navigated the first holiday season after the tape had surfaced with a carefulness that felt like practice rather than performance. They adhered to the new normal of social distance and also to the new normal of small accountable gestures. An offer to mow the lawn, a bag of groceries dropped on the porch, a thoughtful silence when it was needed. The rose bush stolen in spring 2017 remained a tender point, but in June 2021 the gardener, who had become something of a proverb sayer for us, brought cuttings from another variety and, with the bluntness he favored, said, "Different roses, same tending." We laughed, and the laugh felt like a way of keeping the bruise alive without letting it become a wound that defined us. The nurse's own archive deepened. She had always been a careful archivist of the ephemeral, and when, in early 2022, she fell ill, she asked that her small stack of tapes be treated as her bequest to the trust. In March 2022, she died quietly in the very hospital where she had worked for decades. A few members of our group, who had been permitted to stand at the edge of the funeral in a socially distanced line, remembered the way she had tucked a tissue into the collar of the hymn book before the service as though it were a delightful technicality. Her recordings, an eccentric assortment of personal recollections, a light-hearted litany of nursing tips, and a few short fragments of instruction to family members, arrived in a cardboard box labeled in her handwriting, "For the voices." She had written one sentence on a scrap of paper and pinned it to the stack: "If you do anything, be gentle with the laughers." Handling the nurse's tapes revived an old conversation about custodial intent. She had always preferred that some tapes remain sealed, their function to be private presence rather than public record. The trust honored her wish by creating 3 hermetic boxes in which sealed material could be kept for a fixed term or opened only by a consensus of trustees and a named family member. The nurse's bequest clarified an ethical stance we had only ever practiced haphazardly: fidelity to the expressed desires of the recorder, especially when those desires were modest and oriented toward intimacy rather than posterity. Pedagogically, the archive's work continued to expand. In 2022, the community college's nursing practicum created a new module based explicitly on our redacted case studies. That module, taught beginning in September 2022, asked students to think about consent not as a single checkbox but as an ongoing conversation. The grad student who had cited a redacted clip in 2019 returned to the archive with a co-authored article, published in early 2023, that used anonymized material from several donations to argue for practices that capture the flux of agency at life's end. The article made careful mention of the cassette I had been given, not by name or by sound, but as an argument, that institutions must be able to hold both the technical requirements of consent and the soft, personal work of translation between bedside and archive. There were surprises along the way that required our policy to bend in unanticipated ways. In November 2022, a woman came to the trust with a request so small it barely seemed worth mentioning. She wanted to borrow a clip of a lullaby she remembered from a cassette in our holdings so that she could sing it to her newborn. The tape was from the 1970s and had been donated with the stipulation that it remain closed to public exhibition. The donor's family, now long dispersed, had left no clear guidance. We agreed, after consultation, to create a private listening session for the mother and her partner. The session took place in December, with the technician operating the digitizer and buffering the lullaby through discrete headphones. The couple left with the music in their pocket and a sense that they had retrieved a small inheritance. This was the kind of small kindness that satisfied both the letter and the spirit of our policies. Technology continued to be both a resource and a dilemma. By mid-2023, we had migrated our digitized holdings to a more secure, redundant cloud service and instituted 2-factor authentication for researchers requesting files. We also began to experiment, cautiously, with metadata that could help families locate relevant material without exposing private details, a subject tagging system that used broad categories: gardening, recipes, goodbyes, rather than names. We were careful to ensure that tags could not be scraped by commercial entities. Every access request required a human in the loop. The archive, in other words, favored a hybrid model: use technology to make access practical, but keep human judgment where it mattered most. Public engagements multiplied. In October 2023, we organized a panel at the county library, titled Last Things, Voices at the Edge, which included a filmmaker who had previously requested a clip in 2019, now present to reflect on the ethics of representation, a professor of palliative care who spoke about the ways recorded messages can assuage caregiver guilt, and a community member who had found solace in a digitized instruction recorded by her husband before his death. The crowd was mixed: students, hospice volunteers, nurses, skeptical neighbors. A sharp debate erupted about whether archives should move toward openness or remain protective. It ended, as such community debates often do, in a kind of negotiated pause. We walked back to the listening room in a group, the sky a clear, early fall blue, and someone picked up the magnolia leaves that had fallen and rolled them between their fingers. Meanwhile, the cassette my grandfather had given me continued to be a private instrument of orientation. I digitized it with the Trust's new equipment in January 2022, preserving the original reel and placing the file in the secured drive with an access log that would show when anyone listened. I kept listening, sometimes to a particular phrase he used when he admired work, a clipped, almost conspiratorial, "That's real craft." On long, slow evenings when the neighborhood dimmed into a pattern of porch lights, I would press play and hear him say a place name with a cadence I had almost forgotten. The tape did not provide easy answers to the past, but it taught me a practice, to let small acts of attention to voice shape how one moves in the world. It reminded me, as the nurse had taught, that stewarding another's words is more than archiving, it is a kind of fidelity. The Trust's governance matured incrementally. In March 2024, after several years of practice, we codified a set of principles: consent as ongoing, fidelity to donor intent, minimal dissemination, and the presumption of family privacy. We published the principles online with a short commentary about the practical judgments they did not resolve, those gray areas where the archive's human work was indispensable. The release prompted letters from scholars and clergy, from anonymous commenters who accused us of elitism, and from a neighbor who wrote to say, simply, that the cassette had changed how she forgave small cruelties in her own life. Those letters, some flattery and some accusation, became part of a public record that, for better or worse, made the archive's work legible beyond the room warmed by the kettle and the sound of pages. Looking forward, we have planned a modest symposium for October 2024 to bring together nurses, archivists, filmmakers, and community members to talk about stewardship in an era where microphones are everywhere and boundaries between private grief and public curiosity are porous. We intend to present case studies, redacted, annotated, and accompanied by the ethical reasoning we applied, and to invite critique. The goal is not to celebrate our choices as perfect, but to hold them up for the kind of interrogation that can sharpen practice. We are also planning a small, closed exhibition in the spring of 2025 that will focus on caregiving and recorded memory. The nurse's bequest will have a quiet presence there, a sealed cassette, an explanatory panel about triage and tenderness, and a small bench beneath a potted magnolia to suggest that listening is sometimes an act of companionship rather than an act of display. None of this undoes the past. The rosebush theft of 2017 remains a bruise. The recollection of my parents' consultation with one another about what to tell my dying grandfather remains a discreet wound. The cassette does not make those things vanish. What it has done is suggest a set of practices: careful labeling, slow consent, a willingness to instruct rather than to adjudicate, that have reshaped an institution and, in small ways, reshaped some people's lives. The nurses' tapes continue to be both resource and restraint, teaching volunteers to speak modestly and ask patiently. The archive continues to meet on the first Tuesday, sometimes in person, sometimes on a screen, always with the kettle or its memory nearby, and we continue to judge requests with a mixture of lawyering and tenderness. We prepare, in the months ahead, to share what we have learned and to learn from others, knowing that none of these measures is final, but that together they form a practice we hope will withstand the next set of demands and the next generation of voices. We prepared the October 2024 symposium with the same mixture of practicality and superstition that had guided the Trust from its first box donation. Invitations went out in July: nurses with decades of hospice work, archivists who specialized in audiovisual preservation, a small contingent of filmmakers who had engaged with ethical redaction in their work, representatives from the community college nursing practicum that had begun using our materials in September 2022, and 3 family members who had negotiated private viewings of sealed material. The program, published in August, promised case studies and a public reading of the principles the Trust had codified in March 2024. We framed the event not as a declaration. There are no declarations in a practice that trades in endings, but as a public rehearsal of judgment, an attempt to set a practice against the friction of readership and memory. On the day, October 12, 2024, the library's main hall smelled faintly of lemon polish and of old paper. Outside, it rained in a way that felt apologetic rather than mournful. The symposium set a tone I had not expected. Panels that might have become theoretical were grounded by the presence of the nurses' colleagues, who spoke in small, precise sentences about bedside rituals and the power of voice to alter a room's shape. The filmmaker who had first requested a clip in 2019 returned, as planned, To speak about the responsibility of editing, she showed, without sounds, the marks she had made on a transcript, the places she had hesitated and the places she had cut. A professor of palliative care who had consulted on our protocols in 2022, now holding a chair at a neighboring university, took the floor to speak about how recorded messages can be both balm and burden for caregivers. The most surprising intervention came from a pastoral counselor who described a practice she had developed after hearing about our sealed boxes. She took the principles of minimal dissemination and applied them, she said, not to recordings but to conversation, teaching families how to steward each other's stories with the same care we applied to tapes. We also acknowledged the less tidy outcomes. In a moderated session, a neighbor who had written to us about forgiving small cruelties spoke about the cassette and about how, in late 2023, she had used a particular phrase from a donor's recipe recording to restart a conversation with her estranged sister. Her testimony made visible what we had always suspected: the archive's work was not merely institutional, it had been a quietly reparative force in domestic life. But another attendee, a journalist, pressed us on the limits of consent when the recorded subject lacked full capacity at the time of recording. The question landed differently because it spoke to the precise wound at the center of my life. What does one do when a family, in fear and haste, shapes the last thing a person hears? The room held its breath, and someone quoted the nurse's scrap of paper. "If you do anything, be gentle with the laughers," and the room laughed awkwardly and then warmly, as a way of honoring that ethic. The symposium produced several concrete outcomes. We agreed to create a publicly available syllabus, released in November 2024, that any hospice or nursing program could adapt. It included anonymized case studies, a rubric for navigating donor intent, and suggested language for family conversations. We also established a small fellowship, funded by a modest municipal arts grant awarded in December 2024, to support one graduate student each year to study the intersection of audiovisual preservation and end-of-life care. The grant came with a stipulation: fellows must spend at least one day a week listening, in the way our volunteers had learned to listen, which is to say with attention to cadence, hesitation, and what the recorder leaves implied. The trust, in other words, moved from caution to pedagogy. We wanted to ensure that our practices could be learned and, when necessary, improved. At the same time, the symposium reopened a set of personal negotiations I had not fully resolved. The cassette my grandfather had given me, safely stored and logged since January 2022, remained the private instrument it had been, but the public conversation made it harder to keep private what was personal and aching. I had avoided speaking about the tape beyond a small circle, partly to honor my own need for privacy and partly because the wound, the knowledge that my parents had, in consultation with each other, told my dying grandfather that I did not want him, was still raw. The phrase, "I didn't want him," had been delivered in their consultation as part of a rationalization, a way to explain a complicated household economy that had ended in estrangement. It had been, I now understand with a clarified chronology, a version of events told in haste in 2017 when my grandfather's care needs began to exceed the capacity of the home. My parents were frightened and exhausted, and they chose a narrative that made that exhaustion legible to themselves. That narrative became a wound because it was told to a man who, in his last days, could not easily contest it. After the symposium, in late October 2024, I asked the Trust's mediator, one of the volunteers who had been trained in listening and who had presided over several private sessions, to assist in arranging a mediated family conversation. The mediator's training, which had developed out of our December 2022 lullaby session and the private viewing since, emphasized 3 rules. The recording could be listened to only in the Trust's listening room, a neutral facilitator must be present, and the session would be closed to all but named participants. My parents agreed, albeit reluctantly, and we scheduled the session for November 15, 2024. The date felt symbolic. Late enough to let the symposium's energy cool, but early enough to avoid the pressure of the holidays. On the appointed day, the 3 of us sat in the listening room with the kettle gone cold on the sideboard. The technician logged the access in the cloud archive, as required by our mid-2023 security migration, and the mediator reminded us of the protocols: background noise off, phones in airplane mode, no recording of the room itself. My father folded his hands into each other with the same precise nervousness he had always exhibited when confronted with other people's suffering. My mother alternated between stillness and the kind of small, brittle politeness that serves as armor. I, who had listened to the cassette dozens of times in quiet evenings since January 2022, felt a new nervousness, as if the presence of their bodies would alter the waveform in a way I could not predict. When the tape played, the first 15 seconds were the familiar, the clatter of the machine, a cough, my grandfather's voice finding a timbre it had settled on in later life, gentle, with a country cadence that made certain vowels longer, as if savoring them. He said very plainly, "If you listen, know this, I chose my love by small things." He laughed softly. Then he spoke of names and places, of favorite benches in parks, of the sound of rain on the old tin roof. Nothing on that side of the tape contradicted the life we had known. It was intimate and unremarkable in the best sense, full of particularity and absent of grand statements. Then, at the center of the tape, about 6 minutes in, he paused and used a phrase I had not heard before in his voice. I did not want to leave them with a burden. He said them, as if it were a small crowd that included our parents and perhaps people I could not name. The voice wavered, and I realized with a slow, painful clarity that what he recorded was not an accusation but an attempt at solvency. He was offering something like absolution through explanation. I did not want to leave them with a burden. He spoke of pride, of not wishing to be a difficulty, and of an odd, stubborn desire to be remembered as himself rather than as a patient. He folded in a recollection of an afternoon in 1968 when he had mended a fence and a neighbor had called him real craft, and he repeated the clipped, conspiratorial phrase he had used to admire work, "That's real craft," as if playing a private game with his memory. Underneath those lines lay an ache that complicated the wound my parents' consultation had left. Were there words to him, informing him that I did not want him, a phrase which had been delivered in the heat of caregiving negotiations, had been a defensive story? His tape revealed another motive, the desire not to be a burden. The two things could, of course, be true simultaneously. He might have been told one version in conversation and recorded another to manage his own sense of dignity. The tape did not clear the fog, it complicated it, adding new textures, a recorded plea, an attempt to gift a reason that would ease his family's conscience. As the voice wound down to a close, he addressed me by name, an intimate pronunciation, and my mother placed her hand over her mouth, and when she finally spoke, she said, "We thought," and then stopped. It is important to hold that moment in the chronology. My parents did not, in that room, mount a defense. They offered instead small confessions. They had been frightened, they had been ashamed of their inability to provide round-the-clock care, they had wanted to make the path clean for everyone involved. Their admission did not erase what they had told him, it only made their motives legible as human, limited, and fallible. I, who had carried the phrase "I didn't want him" as a wound, felt the wound change shape. It did not disappear, but the edges were softer because I could now see the fear that had made my parents choose those words. We did not resolve everything in that session. There remained unspoken histories. Who had made calls to agencies in 2017, whether other relatives had been consulted, which nights my parents had mourned the life they had before my grandfather's needs escalated. But the cassette had acted as a kind of translator. It allowed my grandfather to speak past his infirmity, to offer his own framing.